So you all just heard the piece of scripture I was working with this week, and you can imagine that it may have been a little bit of a struggle to figure out how to unlock it, because it's a pretty intense story. It's an intense story about brothers throwing their brothers in a pit and selling him into slavery. So let's just jump in, right? In seminary, I had a brilliant professor, Dr. Sue Pak, who shared a story that I've found myself revisiting again and again. It revolves around the experience that she had living with her mother, who had Alzheimer's-related dementia, and how that dementia radically altered long-held family communication patterns. Each day, when Sue would get home, her mother would be there with her bag packed and shoes on, ready to go home. And each day, Sue would have to re-explain that this was home, but her mom didn't buy it. Sue writes, "Trying to remedy the deep longing for home, she waits for me every day to take her home. Home, where is home? Is it her ancestral home in Uiju, way up in the north of Korea, where she spent her affluent formative years under Japanese colonization? Or is it Busan, way down in the south, where she fled from the north and where she experienced extreme poverty and dislocation? Or is it Seoul, where she gave birth to her 4 children and worked hard to make ends meet in the post-Korean War economy, and the place where her own mother tragically died? Or is it New York, where she began her life as an immigrant, speaking in different tongues, eating different food? When I ask my mother where home is, she simply says, "You know, home, over there. Let's go." The other thing that Sue did most days when she got home from work was sit with her mother and untangle yarn. Yarn, like that spun thread that one uses for knitting. You see, Sue's mother had been an avid knitter throughout most of her life, but as the Alzheimer's progressed, her memory of the movement pattern was lost, and her needles only created knots. So each evening, Sue would come home from work, convince her mother that she was home, and then find her mother's crazy tangles. And each evening, she would sit with her mother and meticulously untangle foot after foot of snarled yarn, rewinding it back into a neat ball. This image for me is heartbreakingly tender, embodying all the love and the patience of caring for an aging parent. But it's powerful on another level too. As anyone who has ever had a family member with Alzheimer's might know, one of the primary markers of the disease is the presence of neurofibrillary tangles. These tangles are literally the twisted proteins that form inside a dying cell and block communication. So Sue's mother's mind, just like the yarn she was trying to knit, was literally in tangles. And for Sue, these tangles meant that her mom just kept looping down the same paths over and over again. Thus, it's not surprising that a related sign of Alzheimer's is the need to write and copy things over and over again. One day, while Sue was cleaning out her mother's stuff, she found page upon page upon page of writing telling the same 4 stories over and over and over again. Somehow her mother thought if she could revisit them enough times, she might finally get them right. One story was about the day that Korea was liberated from Japan. Another was the story of the family's journey across the 38th parallel as they fled their home. The next was a story about the day the Korean War broke out. And the 4th story was the story about the day the family landed in the US as immigrants. These 4 pivotal life moments kept replaying in her mother's mind again and again, communicating something about the experiences that had shaped her. Which brings me back to the yarn, because yet another level for understanding the metaphor of Sue working to untangle it for her mother is in something from the Korean culture. She explains, this act connects with the way that Koreans talk about han. Han is a Korean word describing the depth of human suffering. Koreans talk about untangling the han to describe healing from suffering. So, Sue came to know her mother more intimately as she untangled that yarn, both the physical fiber that her mother had labored to make sense of, and the stories that her mother labored to perfect, as if getting them right would somehow free her from the ghosts of that trauma she had experienced. And Sue also came to realize that the ghosts that haunted her mother also haunted her, even though she hadn't lived through those events. She didn't share her mother's memories, but she did inherit certain coping mechanisms and communication patterns that her mother had developed as a response to those events. And if she didn't work to untangle those patterns, she would blindly pass them on to her children as well. And then generation after generation, they would carry these ghosts of a war they never lived. Okay, so what does Sue's story have to do with our strange text for today, where Joseph's jealous brothers chuck him down a cistern and sell him into slavery? I guess I would argue that to understand this tragic moment in the life of these brothers, we have to untangle the family yarn. We have to unearth the ghosts that haunt Joseph's generation, but didn't start with them. But in order to do this, we're going to have to do some major family history and genealogy, so please bear with me. Last week, we talked about Jacob and his worldview built on a fear of scarcity, and how that worldview led him to behave as a trickster, stealing his brother's birthright and family blessing through deceit and clever manipulation. This act of betrayal drives deep, and Jacob ends up running away from his homeland. It takes him 20 years to wrestle with his fear and finally come home to face his brother. But while Jacob's behavior was terrible, he didn't create the tension with his brother single-handedly. The division between Jacob and Esau began in their mother's womb, at which time God explained to their mother Rebekah, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, but the elder shall serve the younger." So we have division and a pattern where the younger ends up being the leader. As the twins grew up, their parents deepened the divide by picking favorites. Dad loved Esau because he was fond of hunting, but Mom, she loved Jacob, the scholar and the homebody. So when she heard that her husband was about to give Esau the final blessing, she colluded with Jacob to trick and steal that blessing. And years of pain sprang forth from that single decision. Now, I know many of us have heard this story like a million times, but I want you to try to really wrap your mind around what a huge betrayal this would be. If your brother stole your inheritance from you with the help of your mother. Many families stop talking with one another over much, much less. Which leads me to this week's story, where we learn that though Jacob has made amends with his brother, he still goes on to repeat the family pattern of choosing a favorite child. All of you who have siblings know what a terrible idea this is. It's a terrible idea for the chosen child, who everybody hates, and it's a terrible idea for the other children who feel less than. In addition to having a favorite, Jacob also goes on to favor his youngest son, going against the dominant cultural tradition, but following in his mother's footsteps. And while as an eldest child, I am certainly familiar with the special treatment the baby gets, this seems a bit more overt. Jacob elevates Joseph above all his brothers, even gifting him with special clothes to make him look the part of the special child. And then there's the other side of the family tree. We know that Jacob's sons were all born of 4 different mothers, 2 feuding sisters and their respective maids. But the divide between the sisters wasn't their own doing either. That divide was cultivated by their father, who tricked Jacob into marrying his older daughter, even though he was in love with the younger one. As far as memorable life events go, I can imagine feeling pretty scarred if my father tricked someone into marrying me, only to have to spend the rest of my life as the less valued wife in a losing competition with my own sister. This leads to an obvious hierarchy among Jacob's offsprings based on whether or not their mother was the wanted or unwanted wife or a lowly servant girl. In this hierarchy, Joseph is again favored because he is the only son of the favored wife. So while the Bible is preoccupied with material inheritance, these stories also give us an account of family patterns and coping mechanisms that are passed down from one generation to the next. And in this case, our main character, Joseph, has a double legacy of sibling rivalry and traumatic deception. Now, let's layer on top of all of that Joseph's own behavior. In one story, the teenage Joseph goes out to help his older brothers who are tending the family herds, as you heard, only to come home and report to his dad that he didn't think they were doing a good enough job. In another story, Joseph has a dream in which the family is out binding sheaves of wheat, and everyone else's sheaf bows down to his, including those of his parents. That's awkward. And then there's another dream where he envisions the sun and the moon and the stars actually bowing down to him. Now, I'm not blaming Joseph for his dreams, but I also don't think all dreams are worth sharing out loud. Anyone paying attention to the family dynamics would know that these dreams would probably not be well received and should probably remain as inside thoughts. But Joseph didn't just inherit a legacy of being the favored child. He also inherited his father's sense of entitlement. The same entitlement that allowed Jacob to believe he deserved his brother's blessing now makes Joseph sure that his whole family will one day bow down to him, sure enough to rub it in their faces. I want you guys once again to step into this. Imagine how you would respond if your younger sibling, or even your own child, told you that one day you were going to bow down to them. And the family communication patterns don't stop with just Joseph. As our story progresses, we see a legacy of deceit and trickery as Joseph's brothers plot to get rid of him, to chuck their brother into a cistern and sell him into slavery. And that was their humane option. Then, after committing this terrible crime, they trick their father into believing that his youngest child is dead. Just as Jacob used an animal hide to trick his dad into thinking that he was the hairier brother and got the blessing, Joseph's brothers use animal blood to lead their father to think that Joseph is dead and gone, having been torn apart by wild animals. Let that sink in. And so the family rift continues to deepen, in this generation just as in the last. And the repeating nature of the family story only continues when Joseph is forced to live far away from his homeland, separated from his people, just as his father was, learning to get by on his wits alone. And I give you all of this background simply to show you the way that family patterns and family trauma can be transferred from one generation to the next. It's almost always invisible to those who are living it, but frighteningly obvious from an outside perspective. How many of you know families like this? Families where the same patterns and roles just keep repeating. The golden child who can do no wrong. the scapegoat in each generation who bears the brunt of family derision, the person who hated their parent only to end up marrying someone exactly like him or her, the culture of icing somebody out or cutting them off when they hurt you, only to have people end up isolated and lonely again and again, or patterns of marital infidelity, or secrecy and shaming around mental illness, or repeated stories of addiction and violence and abuse. These stories are all too common. And perhaps some of you have even experienced some version of this phenomena personally. That awkward moment where you open your mouth and your mother comes flying out, saying something that you swore you would never, ever say to your own child. Or that family fight where you get a glimpse of your own behavior and realize exactly which aunt or uncle's role you have fallen into. No matter how clever we are, family patterns are hard to run away from and even harder to work through. That is, until we untangle the han, the suffering, and arrive back at the original root. Which brings us back to Sue. As she probed more deeply into her relationship with her mother, she explored this notion of transgenerational haunting. The idea that ghosts of past trauma continue to impact each generation until they are seen and heard. But unfortunately, where there's trauma, there is often secrecy and shame. And so the actual events get buried while their energy lives on. And those ghosts affect everything while never appearing explicitly on the surface. The ghosts are often experienced in a way that survivors of trauma have an unarticulated compulsion to repeat those traumatic events. So Sue's mother wrote and rewrote the stories of her life. As the Alzheimer's finally overrode her secrecy and her shame, it allowed her to speak that pain over and over and over again. And though the tangles in her mind might mean that she is never able to leave the endless loop, the more she wrote and spoke these stories, the more insight she gave to Sue. And so she began to know her mother more deeply than she had in 40 years. Now, I know that at the end of the sermon, I'm supposed to tie everything up into a neat little package for you to take away. And believe me, I worked hard this week and tried. But the topic is just too big, and I've already been preaching for too long this morning. So what I'll leave you with is simply an invitation. An invitation to go out and fearlessly ponder the patterns in your family life and your larger family narrative. Perhaps we will never find the root of the original trauma that started those family patterns. But for as long as we have breath in our lungs, we have the opportunity to talk to those who are still alive, in the generations above us or below us. And in these conversations, we can begin to untangle the han. We can begin to break out of the patterns of secrecy and shame and let those old ghosts be seen and heard so they can no longer haunt us. In this way, we begin to untangle and rewind our family's yarn so that the next generation has the opportunity to knit something new, something so warm and beautiful that they will pass it on proudly to those who follow.